There is a strange thing about Too Fast, Too Furious. It is one of the most recognizable movies in the entire Fast Furious franchise, yet it is also one of the easiest to misunderstand. Years after the series transformed itself into a global action phenomenon, this sequel can look almost primitive by comparison. There are no international spy networks, no impossible missions involving the fate of the world, and no giant family assembled for another gravity-defying operation. Instead, there are modified cars, illegal races, Miami nights, loud music, bright colors, and two damaged men trying to figure out whether they can trust each other. And that difference is exactly what makes the movie important. Too Fast, Too Furious sits at a fascinating point in franchise history, because it is still close enough to the original film's underground street racing identity to feel like a car movie, while already beginning to experiment with the larger personalities, colorful ensemble chemistry, and action-driven storytelling that would eventually define the series. Its reputation has often been shaped by comparison. It is not the first movie, because Dominic Toretto is gone. It is not the later franchise, because the stakes are still relatively small. It exists in between, almost like a snapshot of a franchise before anyone knew what it was going to become. And maybe that is why the movie has aged in such an interesting way. Brian O'Connor enters this story having lost almost everything that once gave his life structure. He is no longer comfortably positioned between two worlds. The badge is gone. The career is gone. The identity of being an undercover federal agent is gone. What remains is the thing he understands instinctively: driving. For Brian, a car is not simply a machine that gets him somewhere. It is one of the few places where his past, his instincts, and his desire for freedom can exist without explanation. Then Miami enters the picture, and suddenly the franchise itself seems to breathe differently. Los Angeles in the first film had a gritty nighttime atmosphere, but Miami is brighter, warmer, more exaggerated, and almost deliberately artificial in its beauty. The city becomes a playground of color and movement, where expensive cars, customized imports, beaches, clubs, highways, and criminal money occupy the same visual space. The movie is telling us immediately that the world has changed. And then Roman Pierce arrives, bringing with him something Brian cannot outrun so easily: his past. Roman is not simply another driver. He is the living consequence of Brian's previous choices. Their relationship gives the movie its emotional center because the central question is not really whether Brian can drive fast enough to complete an undercover mission. We already know he can. The more interesting question is whether Brian can trust someone after his last great act of loyalty required him to betray the world he came from. That question sits underneath every race, every conversation, and every dangerous decision. Even the outrageous opening race quietly establishes the movie's philosophy. Cars become extensions of personality. Brian's driving is controlled, measured, almost instinctive. Other drivers turn speed into attitude, aggression, performance, and identity. The cars are brightly colored, heavily modified, visually excessive, but they are never random decoration. They tell us who these people want to be. In that sense, the sequel is doing something surprisingly consistent with the original. It is using car culture to talk about identity. The difference is that Too Fast, Too Furious makes that language louder. It turns the volume up on everything. The colors are brighter. The cars are more customized. The music is more embedded in the world. The action is more exaggerated, The humor is broader. The supporting cast is more colorful. Even the movie's weaknesses are often connected to that deliberate excess. Some scenes feel like music videos. Some dialogue is unmistakably early 2000s. Some physics are treated more as suggestions than laws. And yet the film possesses a personality that cannot be confused with anything else. That is why its position inside the franchise is more complicated than the simple label of lesser sequel suggests. This was a major studio production built around a subculture that, not long before, existed largely in garages, parking lots, magazines, racing communities, music videos, and underground events. The irony is almost perfect. A movie about illegal street racing became a major piece of mainstream entertainment without completely losing the visual vocabulary that made the culture attractive in the first place. To understand why that mattered, it helps to stop treating Too Fast, Too Furious as merely the movie that came between the original and Tokyo Drift. It is a transition point. It shows what happens when a studio discovers that its audience is not only interested in one hero or one story, but in the world surrounding them. And once that world begins expanding, characters can return, new relationships can develop, and the franchise can survive even when its original formula changes. That is the quiet significance hidden underneath all the neon, horsepower, and tire smoke. Too Fast, Too Furious may not be the most sophisticated film in the series, but it helped prove that Fast Furious could become something larger than a single story. And that is what makes the movie worth revisiting beyond the surface-level nostalgia. A conventional recap could simply follow Brian as he races, gets arrested, receives an undercover opportunity, recruits Roman, infiltrates Carter Veron's organization, survives increasingly dangerous situations, and eventually escapes with his friend. But the plot becomes more revealing when we ask what each stage is doing to the characters. Brian begins with freedom, but it is a strangely empty kind of freedom. He is outside the system, yet he has not discovered what should replace it. Roman has his own version of that problem. He has built an identity around anger because anger is easier to carry than betrayal. He remembers what Brian did, remembers the consequences, and has every reason to distrust him. Their partnership therefore becomes more than a practical arrangement. It becomes a test. Can two people whose lives were damaged by the same past create something different from it? Around them, Carter Veron provides a useful contrast. He is not one of the franchise's most complex villains, and the movie does not pretend that he is. His role is more functional. He represents a world where loyalty is maintained through fear, money, intimidation, and control. Veron assumes people can be managed if the consequences are severe enough. Brian and Roman eventually discover the opposite. Genuine loyalty is valuable precisely because it cannot be forced. That distinction becomes one of the movie's most important ideas. At the same time, Miami itself deserves to be treated almost like another character. The city changes the emotional temperature of the story. Sunlight makes the racing world feel open and inviting, while darker interiors and nighttime spaces remind us that the same freedom can become dangerous. Highways suggest escape. Water suggests openness. Bridges connect different worlds. Clubs and racing locations create communities where identity is performed through clothing, music, cars, and confidence. The movie understands that early 2000s car culture was never just about engines. It was about presentation. A customized car announced that its owner had taken something ordinary and made it personal. That same idea applies to the people driving them. Brian's skyline is not merely an impressive machine. It represents a new version of Brian, one no longer defined by a government badge. Roman's aggressive style reflects his larger-than-life personality and his need to appear untouchable. Suki's pink Honda S2000 is unforgettable because the car and the character share the same unapologetic visual confidence. These choices make the movie feel like a time capsule, but not a lifeless one. Anyone who experienced the early 2000s era of modified imports, racing games, DVD special features, car magazines, hip-hop videos, and neon-heavy youth culture can recognize the world immediately. Even viewers who discovered the film years later can feel that atmosphere because the movie commits so completely to its own moment. The technology may date it. The fashion may date it. The dialogue may date it. But the basic fantasy does not. The fantasy is simple: take something ordinary, make it yours, and find a place where nobody can tell you who you are supposed to be. That is why Brian's driving remains emotionally important. He is not simply chasing victory. He is searching for a version of himself that exists beyond the institutions that once defined him. And that is also why the movie's emotional core can be easy to miss. We remember the cars because the cars are spectacular. We remember the races because the races are designed to be memorable. But underneath that spectacle is a story about two people who have not yet figured out how to forgive each other. The movie's real transformation is therefore not Brian becoming a better driver. It is Brian becoming willing to trust again. Roman's transformation is even more obvious because his anger is visible. He has turned resentment into personality, comedy into armor, and confidence into a way of hiding how deeply the past still affects him. When these two characters finally begin moving in the same direction, the movie becomes more than a collection of racing sequences. It becomes a story about chosen loyalty. That is also why the absence of Dominic Toretto matters so much. Without Vin Diesel's character anchoring the emotional universe, Brian has to stand on his own. The sequel cannot simply repeat the first film's friendship dynamic. It needs a different relationship, and Roman provides it. Brian and Roman do not begin as brothers. They begin as people who have every reason not to trust one another. That friction gives the movie its energy. The racing is the visible action. Their history is the invisible action. And once you start watching the film through that lens, even its most ridiculous moments become part of a larger transition. The sequel is teaching the franchise how to build around chemistry rather than a single central relationship. Tej's presence quietly reinforces that shift. He is not yet the fully established team strategist audiences will later recognize, but the seeds are already there: technical knowledge, social connections, and an ability to bridge racing culture with a larger operation. The same can be said for the wider racing community. The film understands that the world becomes more interesting when the hero is not isolated. Cars create networks. Races create reputations. Style creates belonging. The street becomes a social environment rather than merely a backdrop for action. That is one of the reasons the sequel feels different from the first movie. It is less interested in discovering a hidden subculture and more interested in expanding that subculture into a world large enough to support an ongoing franchise. This is where the movie quietly predicts the future. It introduces characters who can carry stories beyond the immediate plot. It emphasizes team chemistry. It increases the scale of the action without abandoning cars. It makes music, fashion, and location part of the franchise identity. And it discovers that audiences can become attached to the world itself, not just the central narrative. In that sense, Too Fast, Too Furious is not simply a sequel. It is an experiment in franchise architecture disguised as a very loud street racing movie. For viewers who grew up around the early 2000s explosion of tuner culture, that distinction can feel almost impossible to separate from nostalgia. There was a particular fantasy attached to customized cars during that era. Racing games turned ordinary streets into imagined circuits. Magazines treated modifications like personal signatures. Music videos filled garages and parking lots with polished imports. DVD menus and behind-the-scenes features made movie cars feel almost as famous as the actors who drove them. And then Too Fast, Too Furious arrived with a visual language that seemed to understand exactly what that audience wanted to see. The movie does not simply show cars moving. It shows cars being admired, customized, raced, photographed, discussed, and used as social currency. Brian's skyline becomes an instant visual statement. It is sleek, distinctive, technologically exotic to the mainstream American audience of the time, and perfectly suited to the idea of Brian reinventing himself. The Mitsubishi Eclipse that dominates the opening imagery represents something different. It is bright, aggressive, highly customized, and almost too stylish to belong to ordinary life. That is intentional. The cars are fantasies of identity. Suki's pink Honda S2000 pushes the concept even further. Its color alone makes it impossible to overlook, but that is exactly the point. Suki does not disappear into the racing environment. She owns it. Her car becomes an extension of the character's confidence, just as Roman's vehicles reinforce his louder personality. The film's obsession with customization therefore makes sense at a thematic level. Everyone is modifying something. The cars are being modified physically. The characters are trying to modify their identities psychologically. Brian is trying to become someone other than the disgraced officer he used to be. Roman is trying to become someone other than the prisoner defined by his past. Even the city seems customized for the movie, transformed into an exaggerated playground of beaches, highways, nightclubs, warehouses, and luxury spaces. This is one reason younger viewers can still connect with the film despite the technology looking ancient by modern standards. The emotional fantasy does not require current technology. It requires freedom. A phone can be outdated and still represent communication. A computer can look primitive and still represent control. A car can be 20 years old and still communicate personality. In fact, the dated technology sometimes strengthens the experience because it makes the movie feel like a preserved moment rather than a world pretending to be timeless. That is the strange power of nostalgia. It does not merely make old objects look better. It gives them context. It reminds us that there was a time when this particular combination of music, fashion, cars, editing, color, and attitude felt completely contemporary. For many viewers, the movie may be connected to childhood television broadcasts, DVDs watched repeatedly, racing games played after school, or conversations about which car looked fastest. The film becomes part movie and part memory. But nostalgia can also hide things. We may remember the bridge jump and the races more clearly than Brian's emotional isolation. We may remember Roman's jokes without remembering why he is angry. We may remember the Pink S2000 without thinking about how deliberately the movie uses visual identity to introduce its characters. We may remember the skyline without considering what it means for Brian to choose a machine associated with a new identity rather than the life he abandoned. Those details are worth recovering because they reveal why the movie survives. Spectacle brought people to it. Personality kept them coming back. The first time you watch Too Fast, Too Furious, the cars are often the main event. Years later, the relationships can become the more interesting part. That shift is important because it explains why the film can remain enjoyable even when some of its effects, dialogue, and technology have aged. The movie is not asking to be admired for realism. It is asking to be remembered for feeling. It captures a particular cultural moment when street racing, tuner cars, hip-hop, gaming, and action cinema collided into one glossy fantasy of independence. And underneath that fantasy is a surprisingly human idea. Sometimes the person who helps you move forward is the person who knows exactly how badly you failed before. Brian cannot erase what happened to Roman. Roman cannot pretend it did not matter. What they can do is decide that the past does not have to determine every future choice. That is the emotional possibility sitting beneath the engine noise. And once that possibility becomes visible, the entire movie starts to look less like a disposable sequel and more like a bridge between two versions of the franchise. The bridge begins with the success of the first movie. The original The Fast and the Furious had taken a very specific cultural world and turned it into mainstream entertainment, combining street racing, undercover crime storytelling, modified imports, action, and a recognizable youth culture aesthetic. Once that formula worked commercially, a sequel was almost inevitable. But the obvious problem was that the original had tied much of its emotional identity to the relationship between Brian O'Connor and Dominic Toretto. Brian was the undercover cop. Dominic was the racer with a complicated moral code. Their relationship gave the first film its central tension because Brian was simultaneously investigating Dom and becoming loyal to him. That story had a natural endpoint. The sequel therefore had to answer a difficult question: what happens to Brian after he chooses the street over the badge? The easiest solution would have been to repeat the same dynamic with different names, but that would have made the sequel feel like a copy. Instead, the filmmakers removed Dominic from the immediate story and forced Brian to carry the narrative himself. Vin Diesel's absence was therefore more than a casting change. It altered the architecture of the film. Brian could no longer define himself through his relationship with Dom. He needed a new emotional counterpart, and that counterpart became Roman Pierce. This choice is one of the most important creative decisions in the movie because Roman does something Dom could not. He knows Brian before the audience meets him in this new chapter. He knows what Brian did, what happened afterward, and what Brian's choices cost him personally. Roman is therefore a form of living history. Their relationship allows the sequel to explore the consequences of Brian's decision in a way that a completely new character could not. The story also benefited from its move to Miami. Los Angeles had given the original a gritty urban texture, with nighttime races and industrial spaces creating a relatively grounded atmosphere. Miami offered a different visual vocabulary. It was bright, tropical, wealthy, colorful, and culturally diverse, with an environment that could support both street racing fantasy and criminal glamour. The city could move from sunlight to neon without feeling like the movie had changed worlds. That flexibility became crucial to the sequel's identity. John Singleton brought his own filmmaking sensibility to this new environment. His background was rooted in character-driven stories, urban culture, social environments, and the way communities shape individual identity. That perspective helps explain why Too Fast, Too Furious often feels more interested in personality and atmosphere than a conventional action sequel might. The movie wants to show how people dress, how they talk, how they move through racing spaces, how they relate to cars, and how music transforms an ordinary location into a social environment. Singleton's direction does not make the film subtle, but it gives the sequel a distinct personality. It does not attempt to recreate the mood of the original exactly. Instead, it embraces a more colorful and playful tone. That choice was risky. A darker, more serious sequel might have seemed like a natural continuation of the first film, but it would not have established the visual flexibility that later installments would need. Too Fast, Too Furious begins the process of making Fast Furious feel less like one movie world and more like a universe capable of changing its environment while keeping its core ingredients intact. The street racing world also had to expand. The first film had introduced viewers to a particular community. The sequel needed to make that community feel larger and more connected. Tej becomes important here because he is tied to the local racing scene while also possessing the intelligence and technical knowledge necessary for the criminal operation. He is an early example of the kind of supporting character the franchise would eventually depend upon. Someone whose value is not measured by being the fastest driver, but by understanding the network around the drivers. Roman fills another role, because he brings emotional conflict and comic energy. Monica brings the undercover dimension. Verone provides the criminal structure. Together, these characters create a broader ecosystem around Brian. The movie is therefore moving away from a simple hero versus villain structure and toward an ensemble. That process is still incomplete, but the direction is visible. Production itself presented a different kind of challenge. Car movies require action that audiences can understand physically. The cars cannot simply be digital objects. They have weight, sound, traction, momentum, and danger. Early 2000s filmmaking had fewer digital shortcuts than modern blockbuster cinema, so practical vehicles and stunt driving remained central to the experience. That physicality gives the movie much of its texture. Even when visual effects are used, the sequences are built around real machines moving through real spaces. The camera is often positioned close enough to the vehicles that viewers can feel the relationship between speed and environment. The result is not always realistic, but it is tangible. That distinction matters. A physically impossible stunt can still feel exciting if the audience senses that something real is moving through space. The bridge sequence, in particular, embodies this philosophy. It is outrageous, exaggerated, and unmistakably designed for spectacle, yet the physical presence of the vehicles gives the moment a weight that purely digital action can sometimes struggle to reproduce. The sequel also had to balance underground racing with a larger crime story. If it had remained entirely about races, it might have felt too small for a major studio sequel. If it had abandoned racing entirely, it would have lost the identity audiences came to see. The compromise was to make driving part of the criminal operation. Brian and Roman's ability behind the wheel becomes a qualification for entering Veron's organization. The car culture therefore remains essential to the plot rather than becoming decoration between action scenes. This was a smart structural decision because it allowed the movie to increase stakes without abandoning its central attraction. Brian does not suddenly become an action hero unrelated to cars. He remains a driver whose specific skill makes him valuable. That continuity helps preserve the franchise's original DNA even as the story expands. At the same time, the sequel's brighter colors and playful attitude reveal that the filmmakers were willing to treat the world as fantasy. The movie is not trying to document Miami's racing culture with journalistic realism. It is constructing a cinematic version of that culture, one where every car looks camera-ready, every location seems designed for a music video, and every race feels like a performance. That approach can be criticized, but it is also what makes the movie immediately recognizable. It does not merely take place in the early 2000s. It looks like the early 2000s through the eyes of action cinema. That is why its production origins matter. The movie was born from the pressure to follow a successful original, but instead of simply reproducing the formula, it expanded the possibilities. It removed the original co-lead, changed the city, introduced new characters, heightened the color, increased the action, and leaned harder into the car culture that had become its commercial identity. The result was not perfect, but it established an important principle. Fast Furious did not have to remain exactly the same to remain recognizable. The landscape surrounding the release made that gamble even more interesting. By the time the sequel arrived, the first movie had already helped push customized import cars deeper into mainstream entertainment. The culture that had once seemed specialized was becoming visible everywhere. Racing games were becoming increasingly cinematic. Car magazines were feeding enthusiasts with endless combinations of body kits, wheels, paint, exhaust systems, and performance upgrades. Music videos borrowed the visual language of modified cars. Young audiences were not simply watching cars in movies, they were learning to recognize models, modifications, brands, and styles. That meant a sequel to The Fast and the Furious carried expectations that extended beyond the story. Viewers wanted new cars. They wanted bigger races. They wanted more customization. They wanted the kind of visual excess that could make a vehicle feel like a celebrity. The skyline became particularly important because it represented something that many mainstream American viewers associated with a more exotic performance culture. Its presence turned the car itself into part of the movie's marketing identity. Paul Walker's return also mattered enormously. Even without Dominic Toretto, Brian remained a recognizable connection to the original. But the absence of Vin Diesel created a strange expectation gap. Some audiences likely wondered whether the franchise could feel complete without its original powerhouse. The marketing therefore had to make the new identity seem exciting rather than incomplete. Cars, women, Miami, action, and music became major selling points because they communicated that the movie was not trying to be the Fast and the Furious again. It was promising another flavor of the same fantasy. That distinction was important. A sequel that copies its predecessor can be criticized for being repetitive. A sequel that changes too much can be criticized for abandoning what made the original successful. Too Fast, Too Furious had to sit between those extremes. It kept Brian. It kept illegal racing. It kept customized cars. It kept the criminal framework. But it changed the location, the supporting cast, the tone, and the visual palette. The result was deliberately heightened. The film's world looks almost like a racing game brought to life, complete with exotic cars, colorful personalities, exaggerated competition, and environments designed around movement. That connection to games was not accidental in the broader cultural sense. Audiences were increasingly learning to understand cars through interactive media, where speed, customization, and visual style were as important as story. A movie like this could therefore function almost like a cinematic fantasy version of the same experience. The audience could watch Brian drive the cars they had seen in magazines or games, hear the engines, watch the modifications, and imagine what it would feel like to control them. That is part of why the sequel's cars became so culturally durable. They were not background props. They were objects audiences could identify with, debate, remember, and sometimes imitate. The challenge for the filmmakers was that the more recognizable the car culture became, the harder it was to surprise the audience through the racing itself. The sequel therefore needed character drama to provide another layer. Brian's personal history with Roman becomes essential because it gives the action emotional consequences. A race is no longer only about winning. It can be about proving credibility, rebuilding trust, or surviving a dangerous criminal operation. That mixture allowed the movie to satisfy two audiences at once, people who wanted cars and people who wanted a continuing story. The film also benefited from arriving during an era when soundtracks were becoming powerful marketing tools in their own right. Hip-hop and R&B were deeply connected to car culture, nightlife, fashion, and youth identity. A movie set in Miami could use music not simply to accompany scenes but to define the environment. The soundtrack helped create an atmosphere that felt contemporary, even when the story itself was relatively conventional. This is another reason the film can feel like a cultural artifact today. Its aesthetic is inseparable from the music that surrounded it. Even the fashion contributes to the sense of period. The clothes, hairstyles, accessories, technology, and visual effects all locate the movie firmly within the early 2000s. But instead of making the film irrelevant, those details give it historical texture. The movie preserves a version of car culture that existed before social media made every customization instantly shareable. There was something different about discovering a car at a local meet, seeing a modification in a magazine, or hearing about a new performance setup through word of mouth. The film captures that pre-social media fantasy of underground communities becoming visible to the mainstream. Its success depended partly on that authenticity of interest. The movie clearly loves cars, even when it exaggerates what they can do. That affection comes through in the way vehicles are framed, introduced, and heard. The camera lingers on details. Engines receive attention. Drivers are associated with specific vehicles. The car becomes part of the character introduction. This creates an important continuity with the first film. The sequel may be louder, but it still understands that the audience is not simply waiting for cars to move. They want to know what kind of car belongs to what kind of person. That relationship between driver and machine becomes one of the film's strongest storytelling devices. It also explains why the sequel's identity survived changes in technology. Modern audiences may have faster phones, better graphics, more sophisticated games, and more advanced visual effects, but the basic emotional appeal of personalization remains. People still modify objects to express who they are. They still use music and fashion to signal belonging. They still dream about freedom through movement. Too Fast, Too Furious simply expresses those ideas through the exaggerated vocabulary of its era. That is why its release landscape matters. It was not arriving into a vacuum. It was entering a culture already fascinated by cars, speed, gaming, music, and visual identity. The movie took all of those elements and turned them into a mainstream cinematic package. In doing so, it helped demonstrate that the franchise's real asset was not only its original story. It was the world around the story. That world comes alive immediately, before the movie has even established its larger criminal plot. The opening street race is important because it tells us exactly what kind of movie this is going to be, but it also tells us what has happened to Brian since the first film. He is not introduced as an undercover officer balancing two identities. He is introduced as a racer who has already crossed the line. The difference is subtle but enormous. In the original, driving fast was part of Brian's investigation. Here, it has become part of his existence. The illegal race is no longer a temporary disguise. It is the closest thing he has to a life. That is why the Mitsubishi Eclipse matters as more than a cool car. It is part of the visual evidence that Brian has reinvented himself. The car is customized, bright, aggressive, and built for a world outside institutional rules. When Brian takes the wheel, he appears completely comfortable. There is no badge, no authority, no official identity to explain. There is simply skill. The race itself establishes his reputation and the social environment around him. These people know drivers by what they can do, not by the institutions they represent. Brian understands that language instinctively. He knows how to position a car, how to read another driver, how to manage risk, and how to perform confidence. Yet the scene also carries a quiet irony. Brian may look freer than he did before, but he is actually living with fewer options. The choices he made in the previous film have closed doors behind him. He can race, but he cannot simply walk back into his old career. He can disappear into the street racing world, but that world cannot fully replace the identity he lost. His arrest makes that contradiction explicit. The fantasy of freedom collides with the consequences of being wanted. Suddenly the person who looked completely in control is reminded that control has limits. This is where the sequel's central psychological problem becomes visible. Brian does not merely need to escape the law. He needs to decide what he is when the law no longer recognizes him as one of its own. His former identity was built around a badge, a mission, and a belief that he could move between worlds. But after choosing Dominic in the previous story, that flexibility is gone. He is no longer the undercover officer who can return to normal life. He is a man who chose a different loyalty and now has to live with it. That makes the offer to regain his freedom especially significant. The undercover assignment is not just a plot mechanism. It gives Brian a possible path back into legitimate society, but only on the condition that he once again enter a world of deception. That creates an immediate tension. The first time Brian went undercover, the central conflict was whether he would betray Dominic. This time, he already knows what betrayal feels like. The question is whether he can complete a mission without destroying another relationship. Carter Verone enters the story as the criminal force around which this conflict will revolve. He has money, connections, confidence, and a willingness to use fear. Brian's driving ability makes him valuable because Verone needs drivers who can operate under pressure. This is where the racing culture and crime narrative become inseparable. Brian does not become useful by suddenly learning how to be a criminal. He is recruited because he already possesses a skill that the criminal world respects. That keeps the movie anchored in its central fantasy. Cars are still the language through which people gain access. Monica Fuentes adds another layer to the operation because she represents the official side of the mission while also becoming personally vulnerable inside Verone's world. Brian is therefore placed between multiple forms of loyalty. There is the law that offers him freedom. There is the criminal organization that demands obedience. And there is the personal history that he has not resolved. That last category becomes unavoidable when he realizes he needs Roman. The decision is practical on the surface. Brian needs someone he can trust behind the wheel. But psychologically, it is much more complicated. Roman is the person who knows exactly what Brian did to him. Recruiting him means reopening a wound that Brian could have left untouched. That is what gives the reunion its weight. Brian cannot simply recruit a skilled driver. He has to ask for help from someone whose life was damaged by his previous choices. Roman's anger therefore feels larger than an ordinary grudge. It is the anger of someone who believes another person's decision changed the course of his life. Brian may have experienced his choice as an act of loyalty to Dominic, but Roman experienced the consequences personally. That difference in perspective creates the emotional conflict that the racing scenes alone cannot provide. Their eventual reunion works because the movie does not pretend the past disappeared. Roman does not immediately forgive Brian. Brian does not have a perfect explanation. Their partnership begins in discomfort, suspicion, and unresolved resentment. And that is precisely why it feels different from Brian's earlier relationship with Dominic. Dom and Brian were drawn together by mutual fascination and shared values. Brian and Roman are drawn together by history. One relationship begins with discovery. The other begins with damage. That distinction gives the sequel its own emotional identity. Around them, Tej becomes a connector between worlds. He knows the racing scene, understands the mechanics of competition, and becomes useful to the larger mission. His presence helps establish the idea that a successful operation requires more than one talented driver. This is an early version of the ensemble logic that will eventually become central to the franchise. The team is not simply a group of people who happen to be in the same story. Each person brings a different form of knowledge. Brian brings instinct and driving. Roman brings aggression and unpredictability. Tej brings technical and social intelligence. Monica brings access and information. Verone brings the threat that forces them to function under pressure. The undercover identities create another layer of performance. Everyone is pretending to be something. Brian and Roman are pretending to be criminals. Monica is pretending to be loyal to Verone. Verone is constantly testing whether the people around him are genuine. In a story filled with false identities, trust becomes almost impossible. That is why Brian and Roman's relationship matters so much. Their personal history is more honest than the identities they are using. They can lie to Verone, but they cannot easily lie to each other. Every joke Roman makes carries some trace of resentment. Every calm response from Brian carries some trace of guilt. Their partnership is therefore built under pressure from both directions. The criminal operation demands that they appear trustworthy while their personal history gives them reasons to doubt each other. The movie's action works because those two pressures gradually become the same problem. The faster the cars move, the less time they have to maintain emotional distance. Eventually, survival depends on whether they can trust the person beside them. That is the deeper structure beneath the plot. The mission may be about money and crime, but the emotional story is about whether two people can move forward after betrayal without pretending the betrayal never happened. Brian's decision to recruit Roman changes the entire emotional temperature of the story. Before that moment, Brian can still imagine that his problems are primarily logistical. He needs freedom. He needs a mission. He needs to infiltrate Verone's operation. He needs a driver who can help him succeed. But Roman turns the mission into something personal. Their shared history means Brian is no longer working with a stranger who can be trusted because of professional competence. He is working with someone who has every reason to distrust him and yet might still be willing to stand beside him. Roman's life after the events of the past is defined by that resentment. Prison has not simply taken away time. It has become part of the identity he carries. His anger is visible because anger gives him control over the story. If he is angry, he does not have to admit how much he was hurt. If he turns every conversation into a joke or a confrontation, he can avoid showing vulnerability. This is why Roman's comedy is more important than it first appears. The character is funny because he is defensive. His confidence is often exaggerated because the person underneath it is uncertain about whether Brian can be trusted again. Brian's response is almost the opposite. He becomes calmer when situations become dangerous. Where Roman expresses insecurity through noise, Brian hides insecurity through control. Their personalities therefore clash in ways that create both comedy and emotional tension. One of the movie's most effective ideas is that these differences eventually become complementary. Roman's aggression can compensate for Brian's restraint. Brian's patience can stabilize Roman's volatility. Neither character needs to become the other. They need to learn how to operate together. The undercover mission gives them a reason to spend enough time together for that process to happen. As they enter Veron's world, their relationship is tested by the demands of performance. They have to appear competent. They have to convince Veron that they are useful. They have to navigate Monica's undercover position without exposing her. They have to understand the money operation. And they have to deal with the possibility that Veron is watching them more closely than they realize. The driving sequences become important because they allow Brian and Roman to establish credibility in the only language Veron truly respects. Skill behind the wheel becomes proof of value. That is a recurring idea in the movie. People are often judged by what they can do before anyone cares who they are. Brian understands this world naturally. Roman understands it through instinct and attitude. Together, they become difficult to dismiss. Roman's confidence also begins to change meaning. At first it feels like performance. He wants to prove that he has survived. He wants Brian to see that he is not the same person he was before. But as the mission continues, the confidence becomes more genuine because Roman realizes he is actually good at what he is doing. The opportunity gives him something he has been missing, a future that is not entirely defined by what happened to him. Brian, meanwhile, begins to understand that Roman's anger is not simply an obstacle. It is evidence of how much the past still matters. This realization is important because Brian's previous identity as an undercover officer encouraged him to compartmentalize people. He could befriend someone while secretly collecting information about them. In this story, that approach becomes harder. Roman knows too much. He is not a target. He is a partner. That distinction forces Brian to become more emotionally honest, even if the movie does not always state that directly. Monica's position inside Veron's organization adds another form of tension. She has to gather information while maintaining her cover, which means every interaction with Veron carries risk. Brian and Roman cannot simply act according to instinct because their actions affect someone whose safety depends on the success of the deception. Veron, meanwhile, uses intimidation to make the entire environment feel unstable. His power comes from making people believe that one mistake will have severe consequences. The criminal operation is therefore designed around fear. Everyone has a reason to obey. Everyone has something to lose. And that creates the perfect environment for the movie's central contrast between forced loyalty and chosen loyalty. Veron can demand obedience, but he cannot manufacture friendship. He can threaten Brian and Roman, but he cannot fully understand why they might eventually risk themselves for one another. This difference becomes more important as the operation grows. The money-running assignment is not simply another criminal task. It is a test of whether Brian and Roman can maintain control while the stakes increase. They are no longer racing for reputation alone. They are racing within a structure where failure can mean violence, imprisonment, or death. The airport sequence intensifies that pressure because it turns the driving fantasy into a logistical problem. They need to move quickly, avoid detection, and convince Verone that everything is going according to plan. The action becomes exciting because the audience understands that Brian's skill is not enough by itself. He needs Roman. Roman needs Brian. The relationship that began as an uncomfortable reunion becomes a practical necessity. That is how the movie quietly transforms their dynamic. They start as two men carrying the same history from opposite sides. They become partners because circumstances force them together. And gradually, without a single dramatic speech completely solving everything, they begin behaving like people who genuinely have each other's backs. The change is visible in small moments. Brian listens more. Roman trusts more. Brian allows Roman to take risks. Roman stops treating every decision as evidence of betrayal. Their humor changes as well. Early jokes can feel like weapons. Later jokes feel like familiarity. That shift is subtle, but it is one of the most important emotional movements in the movie. It also prepares the audience for the central idea that racing is not really about speed. It is about coordination. A driver can be individually brilliant and still lose if he cannot read the person beside him, anticipate another vehicle's movement, or trust that someone will do what they promised. In that sense, the film's racing language mirrors the relationship. Brian and Roman have to learn each other's rhythm. They have to understand when to push, when to hold back, and when to take a risk for the other person. That is friendship expressed through action rather than conversation. It fits the movie's particular understanding of masculinity, where emotional truths are often communicated through cars, loyalty, competition, and physical risk instead of direct confession. The closer Brian and Roman become, the more dangerous Verone's world feels because their loyalty begins to compete with the criminal hierarchy around them. Verone expects obedience. Brian and Roman are developing something stronger and less controllable. The mission may have brought them together, but it is becoming increasingly clear that the partnership itself is becoming the thing worth protecting. As Brian and Roman become more deeply embedded in Verone's organization, the story begins operating on two levels at once. On the surface, the men are trying to complete an undercover assignment without getting exposed. Underneath, they are testing whether their friendship can survive the weight of everything that happened before the movie began. Verone's organization gives the first problem urgency, but Roman's resentment gives the second one emotional meaning. Every time Brian asks Roman to trust him, he is asking for something that the mission cannot guarantee. Roman can believe that Brian is a talented driver. He can believe that Brian knows how to survive. What he cannot easily believe is that Brian will not abandon him when another difficult choice appears. That fear explains much of Roman's volatility. His anger is not simply about the past. It is also a defense against repeating it. If he refuses to trust Brian, then Brian cannot disappoint him again. But that strategy has a cost. Roman also wants connection. He wants to belong to something bigger than his resentment. He wants the chance to prove that his life is not permanently defined by prison and betrayal. Brian's presence forces him to confront both desires at once. The more successful their operation becomes, the harder it becomes to maintain emotional distance. They are sharing risks, making decisions together, and relying on one another in situations where hesitation can have immediate consequences. That is why the airport sequence carries more weight than its basic plot function suggests. The characters are physically moving money, but emotionally they are moving toward trust. Their partnership becomes a kind of controlled chaos. The same is true of Brian. He has always been good at functioning under pressure, but his relationship with Roman forces him to acknowledge that professional competence cannot solve everything. He can drive perfectly and still lose someone's trust. He can complete an assignment and still damage a friendship. He can escape the law and still feel trapped by his own past. That is why the sequel's Brian is more isolated than the confident hero audiences may remember. His calmness is partly strength and partly loneliness. He has chosen freedom, but freedom without belonging can become another form of confinement. Miami looks open, but Brian's internal world is not. He can drive across highways, move through racing communities, and disappear into nightlife, yet he is still carrying the consequences of his choices. Roman becomes the person who can force him to confront that reality. Verone represents a different kind of confinement. His organization may be surrounded by luxury, expensive cars, beautiful locations, and money, but everyone inside it is controlled. His people are valuable only as long as they are useful. Their loyalty is conditional because fear sits underneath every relationship. That makes Verone's world a distorted reflection of the racing world. Both environments have hierarchies. Both reward confidence. Both require people to prove themselves. But one is built around voluntary participation and the other around coercion. Brian and Roman eventually begin to understand the difference. Their friendship becomes meaningful because it is chosen. Neither man has to trust the other. They decide to. That decision gives their partnership more emotional power than the official mission itself. Monica's position complicates matters further because she is operating inside a system where her personal safety depends on maintaining appearances. Her presence reminds the audience that undercover work always carries a cost. Unlike Brian and Roman, who can eventually choose to trust each other openly, Monica has to continue lying to Verone. Her situation makes the movie's theme of identity more literal. Everyone is performing a role, but not everyone can step out of that role whenever they want. Brian and Roman's disguises are temporary. Monica's danger is continuous. Verone's suspicion therefore becomes increasingly threatening because he is the kind of man who interprets uncertainty as betrayal. He does not need proof before becoming dangerous. He only needs doubt. That makes the operation feel unstable even when Brian and Roman appear successful. The more money they move, the more attention they attract. The more useful they become, the more difficult it becomes to leave. Their success is creating its own danger. The film's action language reinforces this escalation. Early races are about reputation. Later driving sequences are about survival. The difference is crucial. At first, speed is freedom. By the midpoint, speed is responsibility. A mistake can hurt someone else. A wrong turn can expose the operation. A failed maneuver can end the mission. Brian's skill therefore becomes less about looking impressive and more about managing consequences. Roman experiences the same evolution. His aggressive driving is initially part of his personality, but the mission teaches him that recklessness has limits. His loyalty to Brian gradually gives him a reason to control that aggression rather than simply perform it. This is where racing becomes a metaphor for trust in the most direct way. Driving requires confidence, but it also requires awareness. You cannot move quickly if you are constantly second-guessing every person around you. Brian and Roman have to develop a shared rhythm. They need to know that when one of them makes a decision, the other will adapt instead of freezing. That kind of trust is difficult precisely because it cannot be forced. Verone can demand that they work together, but he cannot create the emotional bond that eventually makes their teamwork effective. That bond has to come from shared experience. Their history initially keeps them apart, but the mission gives them new experiences that slowly compete with the old ones. Roman begins to see Brian not only as the man who betrayed him, but as the man willing to take risks beside him. Brian begins to see Roman not only as the friend he failed, but as someone capable of standing with him under extreme pressure. This does not erase the past. It changes its meaning. The old betrayal becomes part of the reason the new trust matters. The film is therefore building toward a climax that is not simply about defeating Verone. The larger victory is proving that Brian and Roman can make a different choice this time. Instead of one man sacrificing the other for a mission, they can protect each other while completing the mission. Instead of loyalty being something that creates guilt, it can become a source of strength. That is why the approaching final operation feels more significant than another chase. The audience is no longer only wondering whether the criminals will be caught. The audience is wondering whether this partnership will hold when everything becomes dangerous at once. The answer will depend on whether Brian and Roman have truly changed, or whether their old patterns will return when pressure reaches its highest point. The final act works because the movie brings together the two stories it has been developing from the beginning. There is the external story of stopping Verone and surviving the criminal operation, and there is the internal story of Brian and Roman turning a damaged friendship into genuine partnership. The final operation forces them to stop behaving like two individuals who happen to share a mission. They have to operate as a team. Their escape strategy depends on timing, driving skill, deception, and the willingness to trust the person beside them. Verone's power has always come from control. He controls his people through fear. He controls information. He controls money. He believes that if he creates enough pressure, everyone will eventually act in their own interest. Brian and Roman prove the weakness in that philosophy. People do not always act according to the safest option when they genuinely care about someone else. Sometimes loyalty makes people take greater risks. That is exactly what happens. The cars become central to the climax because the movie has always treated them as extensions of character. Brian's driving is precise and instinctive. Roman's driving reflects his aggression but also the confidence he has developed through the mission. Their vehicles are not merely escape machines. They are the physical tools through which their personalities become action. The final pursuit therefore feels like the logical conclusion of the film's visual language. Everything that has been established about speed, customization, risk, and trust comes together in motion. The bridge sequence is particularly important because it turns the film's obsession with freedom into something almost literal. A bridge is a structure that connects one side to another, and the characters are physically trying to cross from danger toward freedom. The stunt itself is exaggerated, but its emotional meaning is surprisingly straightforward. These characters are trying to get out. They are trying to leave behind the criminal world that has been controlling them. Brian's driving skill becomes essential, but so does Roman's contribution. Neither man can complete the escape alone. That is the point. Brian began the movie isolated. Roman began it angry. By the climax, isolation and resentment have been replaced by cooperation. Monica's role in bringing down Verone completes the official side of the story. The mission succeeds because different forms of competence come together. Brian and Roman provide the driving and deception. Monica provides the undercover intelligence. The larger operation provides the structure necessary to finally expose Verone. But the emotional victory belongs to Brian and Roman. Verone loses not simply because the protagonists are better at driving, but because his worldview fails. He assumes fear creates loyalty. It does not. It creates obedience until someone finds a reason to resist. His organization is held together by threats, while Brian and Roman's partnership is increasingly held together by trust. That contrast gives the villain a thematic purpose even though he is not especially complex psychologically. He is the negative example. He shows what loyalty looks like when stripped of friendship. The recovery of the money adds another layer of ambiguity to the ending. Brian and Roman do not simply return to ordinary institutional life. They emerge with a new relationship to freedom. They have operated outside the law, completed a mission for the authorities, and still retain some of the rewards of their criminal world. The movie is not interested in giving Brian a clean moral reset. That is important because Brian's character has never fit comfortably inside simple categories. He is a former officer who races illegally. He is a fugitive who helps law enforcement. He breaks rules while caring deeply about loyalty. The ending accepts that contradiction instead of resolving it completely. Brian is not going back to being the man he was before. Roman is not going to pretend his anger never existed. What changes is the relationship between them. They have discovered that their shared past can become a foundation rather than a prison. Their reconciliation is therefore more meaningful than a simple apology. It is demonstrated through behavior. Brian risks himself for Roman. Roman stands with Brian when it matters. Their partnership becomes the proof that the past can be acknowledged without being obeyed forever. That idea also explains why the movie closes on freedom rather than punishment. A more conventional crime story might end by restoring order and placing every character back inside a clear moral category. Too Fast, Too Furious chooses something more ambiguous. The protagonists have crossed boundaries, taken risks, and benefited from the world they were supposed to infiltrate. Yet they have also found something genuine inside that chaos. The ending therefore feels like a continuation rather than a conclusion.